We are going to start today with the end of the Cold War. And so remember just to refresh ourselves that the Cold War is this feeling of tensions, some military interactions between the two different philosophies of communism and democracy. So we've had we talked about Korea, we talked about Vietnam, we talked about, um, other situations, Hungary, um, Poland, um, lots of different situations in which the United States, along with our allies, are going to try to, combat and stop, contain the spread of communism. So that's that Cold War from the end of World War II. Then we're going to wrap it up in the early 90s. So let's go ahead and get started today. So, in our study of U.S. history, we are now in the 1980s with President Ronald Reagan, and his philosophy was that we're going to commit ourselves to the largest peacetime military buildup in our history. Why did he dedicate billions of dollars to the development and production of different weapons? Because he thought that we could get peace through strength. And so that's that. I have two missiles and you only have one, so you probably would be less likely to strike against us. And so it's challenging communism through uh, building up our military to try to weaken communism and deter it. Um, and so this is going to be pretty effective. Okay, so his philosophy is peace through strength. And so what does he do? Again, as we've mentioned, our spending on defense during his presidency is going to be, phenomenal, especially after that feeling of détente that was um, conducted during the 1970s. We tried to be peaceful, we tried to be, um, you know, sign agreements and limit our number of nuclear weapons and other kinds of weapons through, SALT and 1 and 2 and through Henry Kissinger's, economic and diplomatic relations. And it's going to be much different. And so we're going to build things such as the B-1 and B-2 bombers, which were, these tremendous um, uh, flying machines that could, wreak havoc. We also have MX missile systems, which were, again, had nuclear capabilities. But probably the biggest one is our Strategic Defense Initiative, and SDI, or it was nicknamed affectionately Star Wars. Okay, and so again, we're going to talk a little bit about that here in the next slide. But Reagan, remember, he believed that the Soviet Union they could not spend as much money as we have. So there's no way that they were going to be able to match our military buildup. So he thought that this was a way that he could, get them to, maybe choose another system other than communism. And so let's just talk a little bit about what Star Wars is. And so it's this defense system. And if, the threat right here of missiles being launched by the Soviet Union, then we would have this whole system, all right, of, Army and Air Force and, Star Wars out here. And so basically what was happening is we would have these systems of radar, both, in the air and on the ground to detect if these, threats were launched against us. And we could basically shoot them down or stop them. And so before they could land and do damage. And so that is called Star Wars, of course, because during this time, the whole Star Wars series at that time, it was a trilogy. Um, it was being, played out in movie theaters. This is going to be a war that's going to be fought basically, you know, up amongst, quote, I'm using air quotes here, the stars. And so there would not be any or very limited interactions on the ground. So it was a huge system, still is in place to a degree today. Um, and it was, you know, a lot of people embraced it because it used new technology. And you didn't need all these bases and things like that and land, and you could, ultimately save a little money, but initially to getting it going, it was quite expensive. So Star Wars is going to be, very, very effective. Okay. Um, um, so let's talk about this. Our main foe during the Cold War, and that's the Soviet Union. In 1986, they are going to have a new president of the Soviet Union come into power, and his name is Mikhail Gorbachev. And he had a very different um, philosophy towards the United States and towards, um, uh, you know, continuing on, this puff up your chest, um, and we're going to, match you in every way. He doesn't believe that. He believes he ushers in this new era, and there's two parts to it. One is glasnost, and that means a new openness. And what does that exactly mean? That means, openness to a relationship with non-communist countries, and openness to maybe, exploring a new system. um, and why was this something that he wanted to do? Well, because the Soviet Union's economy basically had fundamentally failed. I mean, they had starving people, their factories were way behind, and they could not compete with Western ones. So their markets in which they could sell their goods were very limited. And, keeping up with the United States and in that image of, we're this big bad country was quite expensive, and they could not do that. The other philosophy or policy that he instituted was perestroika. And what that essentially meant was that he wanted to reform that Soviet system. And remember when we talked, well, you talked about this a lot last year. Soviets were like, satellite countries. They were, we would kind of equate them to states, in which they, um, you know, eh, controlled what went on there economically and politically, um, locally in that area. But again, everything came from the Communist Party. And so this perestroika was moving away from that, and acting as, you know, independent little countries or states, and not having everything being controlled by the central government, the communist government. And so these two ideas are going to be pretty well received, again, not only in the Soviet Union, but also by the United States. And he knew that he being Gorbachev, that the Soviet Union could not keep up with the United States. And so he felt like, if we could save a little face with this, let's do it. Um, and so it is going to, change um, President Reagan's attitude towards Gorbachev. And he being Reagan, began to reevaluate the position of the United States towards the Soviet Union. This is Mikhail Gorbachev right here, very famous for his birthmark that he had on the top of his head. And so Reagan softened his attitude and began to negotiate, began to extend his hand, an open hand, not a fist. And he is not, at one point he called the Soviet Union the evil empire. Again, going along with that Star Wars theme. And he's going to, say, hey, I was talking about a different era. This is a new era. And they begin to negotiate. One of the things that they did was the START. Same thing along with the SALT. And this is going to reduce the number of nuclear weapons that not only we had, but also that the Soviet Union had. And uh, it is going to, again, bring a reduction in our defense spending, and also some of that reduction, that tensions that we had between the two countries. And so these two men, very important in ending the Cold War. Now, one of the areas in which communism, was, is going to be in East Germany. Okay, so remember we talked about this as one of the conditions that happened after Yalta, towards the end of World War II. They decided to divide up Germany into 4 regions, and then they also decided to divide up Berlin into 4 regions. And as we talked about, you had the Berlin airlift, right? And then in the 50s, and then eventually what's going to happen in 1961 is that there's so many people that are going to be trying to get out of East Berlin into West Berlin, getting out, leaving communism, going to democracy, that the communists are going to build a wall. And it's called the Berlin Wall, and it divides East from West and prohibits people from going back and forth. And just basically, it wasn't overnight, but before they built the wall, there was, this solid wall. There was, barbed wire. There were checkpoints and things like that. And families would be divided. People could go back and forth between them, but after the wall, very limited. And, as I said, families were divided, and some, never saw each other again. And so in 1989, President Reagan is going to go to Berlin, and he is going to give a very famous speech in which he says, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And he's encouraging, to get rid of this division, let Berlin act as one, and basically, get rid of communism. And so within a year, this wall is going to come down. And you can see, this is obviously on the West Berlin side. You can see the graffiti. And here are the Soviets, knocking it down, people standing on it with pitchforks, with hammers, and families reunited, and people taking parts of it as souvenirs. And if you go to Berlin now, they do have, very famous checkpoints. They have, kept some of it intact, just as a reminder, not as a barrier, but as a reminder of what it used to be like, so that we do not go back to that. Another area in which, the Cold War is going to impact, the end of the Cold War is going to impact, is all of these countries that were the, here's your Iron Curtain that Churchill was talking about, between, democracy and communism. These buffers, these countries that were considered the buffer zone, are going to eventually, get rid of communism in their countries. And so, in 1989, we had Poland, we had Hungary, we had Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania are all going to get rid of their communist governments. And very famously, probably one of the most famous is going to be this man right here. His name is um, Lech Wałęsa, and he is going to lead, um, a democratic movement in Poland to bring down the communist country. Very successful. You can see him. He's meeting with George Bush, who was the vice president at this time. We also have in Albania down here, and also in Yugoslavia, right? And remember, Yugoslavia is, gosh, just they just threw together a bunch of different Slavic speaking peoples, which had different religions, which had different um, um, nationalities, and they put them all together underneath one um, communist rule. And we know that that's going to fall apart. And we'll talk more about that. That is not going to be something very peaceful and easy. It's going to be quite deadly, the fighting that's going to happen between those different groups in that country, in that region, I guess is the way to say it. We also have in the Soviet Union in 1991, even though there's going to be a coup that is going to try to, keep communism and is going to try to reject glasnost and perestroika, that coup is going to be put down. And Boris Yeltsin, who is going to be the successor to Gorbachev, is going to emerge as the leader of this largest former Soviet. And they're going to be called republics, and they're going to be divided into 15, and you can see them, all down in here: Kazakhstan, Russian Federation, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, right? Ukraine, Belarus, and then Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, all those. So basically, the Soviet Union, right, is going to break into these 15, Soviets or republics. And so Boris Yeltsin is going to take up what the Gorbachev and Reagan. And so it's going to fall into Bush and Yeltsin to try to bring about that ultimate peace. Okay, so the two things that happened is that the communists are going to be thrown out of government, and then we're going to have 15 independent republics. Here is Reagan giving his speech, asking Gorbachev to tear down the wall. And here is Yeltsin and Bush in one of their many meetings in which they are going to end the Cold War, and communism is going to come to an end in the Soviet Union. And so in 1992, some people would say 1991 is when the Cold War is going to end. So from 45 and all that money, all the lives that were lost, is going to end with handshakes and agreements, and the Cold War will be over. So hopefully that puts a nice little bow on that, and we will talk about this and the impact of that in future lectures. Thanks for coming. Talk to you later.